Hi, I'm going to tell you a little bit about stock and flow models and one particular model that I worked with, SPEWTrend, that describes how technology evolves over time. So I'm going to start with a little bit about how stock and flow models generally work, why this model SPEWTrend was originally created, and then some features of that model that might be useful for the current project. So all stock and flow models use really simple math, like grade school math. So 3 apples plus 2 apples equals 5 apples. If you have 3 and somebody gives you 2, you have 5. If you have 5 and somebody takes away 1, then you have 4. And so you might imagine the number of apples you have collecting in a bucket, which we can call a stock. And you might have a flow of apples into the bucket, and apples are falling out of the bucket. So the apples into the bucket and falling out of the bucket are called flows. And so you can see if there are more apples flowing into the bucket than out of it, that the stock will build up. And if there are more leaving, then the stock will get depleted. So that's the basics of a stock and flow model. Now, in system dynamic models, other factors are allowed to influence the flows and to create complex connections. So imagine instead of a simple flow, you had a person who was shoveling at a certain rate, and the faster they shoveled, the more apples they could get in. So that person and their capabilities affect the flow and hence the stock in the bucket. And then you can imagine other factors that the bucket affects. So imagine that those apples are, say, falling into a lake. So this is going to get pretty speculative. But so there's organic matter in the apples, and it might influence the lake. And the lake is feeding the trees, and maybe the trees get less good water, and so they produce fewer apples to shovel. So then you have something called a feedback, and it's that network of connections coupled with a stock and flow model that creates a system dynamic model. So this model, SPEWTrend, was developed specifically for emission scenarios. It's a model I developed. We might choose to use another one. We're going to look for the one that is most appropriate. It's called SPEW because it used to be speciated pollutant emission wizard, and so it seemed like an appropriate name. But what it does is it keeps track of all the emitting technology, and then it can calculate how much emission is coming out. And so this is an example of its product. It looked at how different kinds of vehicles came into being and then were retired over a period of 50 years, given what we know about retirement rates. And it asked the question, even if we implement standards now or as quickly as we know how quickly will particulate matter get removed from the atmosphere? Some of the connections in the model are shown here. I'm not going to go through these, but these are the kinds of connections that you can build. So I'm going to go through 3 features that help SPEWTrend do scenarios and point out some that may be useful for the current project. I'm going to use examples of vehicles because I think it's easy to think about different kinds of cars, but it doesn't have to be cars. It can be anything. So the first thing is it assumes a heterogeneous population, and that's some of the development we want to do and respect. It takes variables from scenarios that other people have developed. So you can make it consistent with other people's scenarios and dig into the part that you want. And then it can use other variables flexibly in making choices. So you can make it respond to itself and its environment. And this is a descriptive model. It's not an optimization model. It's like a what if. What if this relationship existed? What would happen in the world? So here's a heterogeneous population of cars. The first car can be 20 years old, was not built to emission standards, and has been driven, let's say 20,000 miles. Now, most cars that old would be driven more than 20,000 miles, but let's say this very special kind of car that's been sitting around and carefully kept. Then there's a 10-year-old car built to okay emission standards, and there's a 2-year-old car that's new and clean, and it's representative of the kind of technology we want to see on the road. The other thing we need to have a population is we need to know how many there are. So there may only be 400 of those 20-year-old cars, and they may not be driven very much, but when they do, they're high emitters, and so they can be important. And so each group of cars knows how many there are. To harmonize with scenarios that are already developed, we can use an output from an integrated assessment model, for example. And IAMs are really good at projecting, about how much fuel people are going to use under certain circumstances. What they don't say is exactly how that fuel is used. So let's say we take what the integrated assessment model does really well, and it says, we're going to use 2% more fuel, but we don't know how. So then SPEWTrend would say, okay, we need 8,000 new cars to use that much more new fuel. So that many cars are going to go on the road. Which bucket are those cars going to go into? Well, they're going to go into the new and clean category because that's what's being sold now. So you might add 8,000 to that bucket with a different age. But that also depends which cars are chosen. So if people have a lot of money, then they're likely to choose those new and clean cars. But in a situation where people have less money or a country where standards are not as tightly enforced, you might get some new ones and some older ones on the road. So that gets to, you can model the choices that are made based on other variables, in addition to making the choice of which cars will be put on the road. Imagine a car is going to ask, am I going to retire? And it's not the car's decision, it's the owner's decision. But you can imagine that some properties of the car are going to affect whether it's going to retire. So it could have low mileage, but a high age. So the owner thinks about that and decides, is this a car I want to keep? There could also be some other influences. So for example, the owner's income or social norms that owner is exposed to. The government could have emission standards and buyback programs. And so that whole decision about retirement can take information from the car itself, its owner, or its surroundings like the government. So how is that actually done? Usually it's some kind of multinomial choice model, but you can use any function and just define that as the retirement choice function. So let's say it comes up with a probability of 25% based on itself and everything around it, and then 25% or 100 of these cars would retire and be taken off of the road. And that is how that information would go into the flow model. In actuality, this can get really complicated. So here's a mixed logit model published by a couple of authors, including Daniel McFadden, who was one of the big promoters of multinomial choice models. And so you can have all these variables. So theoretically, if you had the data to support the relationships, the model could do all of this because the functions for choice are quite flexibly defined. In practice, the limitation is how much data you can get. So then you can model heterogeneous choice among the population. Each group of cars thinks about whether it's going to retire based on who owns it. And you can mix and match owners and vehicle types. And again, the vehicle groups are what we've used before, but it could be anything. It could be households or heat pumps. So then the choices that are made in turn set what happens later. So If more of the older cars choose to retire, then you see that population growing smaller until over a period of years, those different populations grow, and eventually you get to a point, if you have selected the right incentives, that the new and clean cars are dominating the population. That may not always happen, and that's part of what we want to explore.